We're delighted to have you joining us for our second session of our conference, The Future of Human Connectivity. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Facebook, Nokia, and Qualcomm, for their support of today's program. For the next hour, we're going to look at what the future holds for smart cities and 5G technology, paying close attention to how we ensure this technology bridges the rural-urban divide and gets to those in underprivileged urban areas as well. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us, and I hope you do, at #TheHillConnects. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, just click refresh and it'll all go away, or it'll get better. Our first guest of the hour is Daphne Kohler. She is the CEO and founder of the company Insitro, which is aiming to transform drug delivery by combining machine learning with biology. She's also the co-founder of Coursera, and in 2012 was one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. Welcome, Daphne. Great to be with you here today. You have, you also worked at Calico, which is another, one time, Calico, which is an alphabet company. I mean, I think that it's, its raison d'etre is really to sort of end death. I mean, you work at all the cool companies, including the one you're at now. And so you're, I think, right at the nexus of some of the things we've been talking today, which is machine learning, AI, how technology is going to come together at this point and just create new platforms and opportunities that we can't even imagine today. So why are you doing what you're doing, and what can you see with the rest of us want to have a peek at?
Well, I think we really are at a moment of unusual change in terms of the availability of technologies that are coming together from a whole slew of different areas and allowing us to do things that we would never have imagined. Specifically, what I'm doing right now is what I believe is is part of the beginning of a new era, which I think of as digital biology. Over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen two parallel threads that have emerged. One on the life sciences, in the increasing availability of tools that allow us to measure biology at unprecedented fidelity and scale, and also manipulate biology using very precise tools. And what we have on the other side is the ability to now interpret the amount of data that we're getting from these different measurements and really come up with a closed loop, if you will, where we measure biology, interpret what we see, and then go back and write biology to do things that it would never otherwise have done.
We have a lot of lay people watching today's show. What sorts of problems does machine learning in the digital biology space help us to deal with?
It helps us do multiple things from, for instance, designing new proteins. There's been a tremendous amount of progress on that, from measuring cells and really looking at the cellular level at what a healthy cell looks like versus a sick cell, and then identifying interventions that revert the unhealthy to a healthy status. And then in terms of our ability to measure human genetics, for instance, and understand the causal factors, in many cases in hundreds of genes that come together to produce complex diseases like Alzheimer's or autism or diabetes or cardiovascular disease. And I think we're now finally starting to understand the causes of some of these complex diseases, as well as being able to identify interventions that potentially revert those.
You know, one of the privileges I have in this job is I get to interview lots of fascinating people. I've interviewed Dr. Fauci several times. I've interviewed, top scientists in the medical and health space. And one of the consistent themes that runs through, particularly with viruses like we're facing today in today's pandemic, is that many people saw this coming. I mean, just the uniformity of agreement that America underprepared, the world underprepared. They did some things, but we need to sort of take a platform approach. And so in your world, in a way, you're kind of talking about platform methodologies, platform methodologies that can be used and applied across a set of things. Is that a leap in itself to be thinking that way, or am I just behind the times?
No, I think you're not behind the times. I think there have been a few platforms in the biology space, but it's certainly not been the traditional way of thinking about things. A lot of traditional biology is very much hypothesis driven, where a brilliant scientist comes up with a thread, with the end of the thread, a new insight, and then follows that to come up with a new discovery, which is awesome. But the sort of engineering mindset of a repeatable process that one can then just turn the crank and new outcomes emerge from that, that is a relatively new approach, and it occurs now at multiple different places. It occurs in new therapeutic modalities, where some of the more recent entrants into the space, and this is more of a 20-year thing, but where there's been this ability to sort of think about how do you turn the crank to come up with new medicines, for instance, whether it's new proteins or new other types of therapeutic modalities. And then I think the other place where we start to see platforms is in some of, for instance, the work on human genetics to try and uncover the causal basis of disease. And there's now tools that start from sequencing of the human genome and then multiple computational tools for interpreting those sequences to really get at the underlying causal mechanisms here. So those are all platforms that when you start to string them together can become increasingly powerful.
Let me ask you a question that maybe it's a science fiction type question, but are there things that we should be worried about that we're not seeing? I mean, I recently had the CEO of CRISPR on a show we did here at the Hill. Fascinating conversation, and we talked a little bit about the norms and the habits and science and how it proceeds. But not everyone plays by those rules, and we've seen, no matter where you are on the question of COVID and the SARS-CoV-2 virus, a zoonotic. Everyone agrees. A lot of people agree it's a zoonotic virus, but some people are beginning to say maybe this is the kind of thing that could be manufactured and created. From your perspective of being deep down in the arena of technology and machine learning, what keeps you up at night? What do you worry about?
So I think there's two different ways of thinking about this risk. One is the way in which evil people might end up using technologies that could be used and are being used for good, but having those people use them in ways that are really detrimental to society. And the creation of viruses is one such example that we're very familiar with already on the computational side. I mean, there's been some very nasty computer viruses out there that have done tremendous amount of damage, and it's a constant arms race between the people trying to create computer viruses and the people who are trying to defend against them. So that's one angle. The other one, which I think is honestly equally risky in some ways, is the fact that we're building increasingly complex systems that we just genuinely don't understand. And sometimes these systems have unexpected behaviors, feedback loops that sort of cause escalating behaviors that could potentially lead to things like crashes of entire economies, which is kind of the precursor. What we saw in 2008, 2009 was in some ways a precursor to that, in that we built an economic system whose consequences we didn't fully understand. And as we start to build increasingly complex systems, like for electric grids and others that rely on technology that is really quite complex, that can cause failure modes that we would not have previously predicted.
Daphne, in your arena, I mean, I'm fascinated by not only your current company and what you're trying to do with machine learning, but your path and at Coursera, at Calico, and I've been recently talked to another female head of research and development yesterday of Innovio, and so we're beginning to see here and there more leading women scientists. But I just want to ask you about this inclusion question, because you are. And I, in my world, remain one of the most influential people in the world. But what does that world look like? Is it inclusive? Do you find changes happening? You're in the high-tech arena. Is this still a white male-dominated scene, or are you beginning to see progress?
I think both are true. There is progress, but it's still very much a white male dominated field. And while there are obviously the cases that we all hear about, the really egregious Me Too cases, which are, as they should be, front and center in people's minds. But what I think people don't talk about nearly as much, but is very pernicious, is the much more subtle forms of discrimination, where you walk into a conversation with as part of a group with and the people on the other side assume that because you're a woman, you're the administrative assistant, you're not the CEO. And that happens to me quite often, and I think it's part of the thing that makes it challenging for women to really advance in the world, if everyone assumes that they are that they're not the important person in the room. And I think it's a really challenging mindset, because how do you, as a woman, it's hard to find a way to respond that isn't problematic. You can just let it go and just have that impression persist. Or the other option is say, wait a minute, but I was the one who came up with this idea. And then, of course, you're treated as being overly aggressive and seeking credit. And so there's kind of like a no-win situation. Letting it go is not great, and speaking up for yourself is not great either. So one thing that I always suggest when I'm asked this question at various panels is that it's up to the people around you to notice when situations like this happen, and speak up for women, speak up for people of color, and say, wait a minute, it wasn't your idea, John. It was Mary's idea, or it was the idea of Jose or whoever it was who came up that got ignored the first time they came up with this idea.
I really appreciate your candor on that. It's something I think is important to highlight and to raise, because I've heard things very much, and so I appreciate you sharing that experience. Let me ask you to not put on your Coursera hat, but your experience with online education and changing it, because part of this new world we're talking about, and I guess there's always a tension between, do you design something for the smartest kids in the room, or do you design something to kind of bring everyone along? And we're basically about to make a technological strategic leap. And I guess my question is, for people who are going to get jobs in this area, people who are going to have literacy in this area, how do you bring on, there's no school, 4-year college, liberal arts degree that's necessarily ready for the world we're stepping into. So I'm just interested in your insights in how we train and prepare a society that doesn't have literacy in what we're creating. I don't have literacy in it. I'm trying to, but, sign me up for a Coursera class.
I think before we even get to Coursera classes, there is a tremendous inequality of just access to basic technologies, and the ability of people who don't come from privileged backgrounds to have access to internet, to have access to basic devices. I mean, yes, it is true that most people have a mobile phone and even a smartphone, but that's a very limited tool if what you're looking to do is have a meaningful educational experience. You can't really type on it very effectively. You can't do homework assignments. So how do you get people to have access to even just the core capabilities that would give equality in terms of opportunities for education? And I think that's, again, it's exacerbated by the fact that a lot of those people are first generation educated, and so their parents are unable to help them or unable to provide them support. So we know how much how important it is for parents to be there and support their children. That was true even when we were just talking about reading and writing, but now that we're talking about access to technology, I think it's even more important. And when the parents don't have those skills, it's much harder for the kids to be technology savvy and really engage in this digital world that provides some of the rest of us amazing opportunities, but they're kind of shut out.
I also want to ask you about the health of the science ecosystem in the country. And you've worked at a lot of private firms in this, but all of the firms that I think, have relationships with universities, some of those have relationship funding universities with things like the National Science Foundation or the NIH. And I guess one of the shockers that I learned recently is, became aware of just how paltry the science investment, say, in the National Science Foundation is. NSF is not NIH, but National Science Foundation has an $8 billion budget, and I met the former director who was then fighting to get her budget from about $7.5 billion to $8 billion. We're talking $1 billion, which may sound big, but it's pathetically small when you look at that as the national investment in the science partnerships in the nation. So I'm editorializing, I'm allowed to do that. But I mean, what do you think? I mean, you're a scientist, you're in this world, does this suck?
It sucks incredibly badly. It sucks on a couple different dimensions. So not only is there limited financial support for science, there's also a surprising amount of disrespect for basic scientific findings. And I think we've seen that in, frankly, the response to the coronavirus pandemic, where basic scientific observations about, say, the importance of wearing masks are ignored, and there's science behind this, and people have done incredibly rigorous studies to understand the value, for instance, of wearing masks, and there's groups of people who just ignore and dismiss that science, and that causes tremendous harm, because with the proliferation of different news outlets that we have around us, and the difficulty in knowing what is true news and what is fake news, it becomes easy for people to dismiss rigorous science in favor of fake science, and cause tremendous harm to individual people, and especially in the context of an infectious disease like COVID-19, to the people around them. So I think the funding situation is one serious issue, and just the lack of respect for scientists and the rigor of the scientific method is, I think, an equally or even larger problem. One of the things that I hope might happen as a very thin silver lining out of this coronavirus pandemic is if we are in fact able as a society to create a vaccine in 12 to 18 months and really help us emerge from this mess, then maybe people will realize that the only way we were able to get there is by decades of investment in the basic scientific foundations that made this possible. And maybe that will increase the willingness of society to pay a little bit more to the NIH budget and the NSF budget so that we're able next time some really bad thing happens, whether it's another pandemic or frankly the crisis of climate change that is rapidly looming, and we've kind of lost sight of that because of COVID-19 and the fact that it's consuming all of our attention cycles. But that's not gone away, and when we get there, we're going to need some really rigorous, valuable science to help us get out of that mess. And so hopefully, maybe as a consequence of this crisis, people will realize that science and investment in science is absolutely critical.
Well, Daphne, you put a really important question. My colleague and friend, our editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack of The Hill, is here with us in the studio and listening. And I think it'd be a fascinating editorial subject once we get past this virus, once there is a vaccine. Science has hopefully saved us. And then the editorial question is, will anyone remember that? I think that's a fundamental issue. So Daphne Kohler, CEO and founder of InCitro, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll come back. Great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Before we get to that bright future of smart cities adept at being responsive to the needs of their citizens, we must first have the technological infrastructure in place. My next two guests are experts on this subject. Shirley Bloomfield is the CEO of the Rural Broadband Association. We've been discussing the rural broadband connectivity issue a lot today. This represents nearly 850 independent telecommunications companies in small-town America. And Jonathan Adelstein is the president and CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association, which is comprised of 200 firms building wireless broadband facilities across the United States. He was also a former commissioner at the FCC, and of course, we started with the chairman of the FCC at today's forum. Welcome to you both. Great to have you here. So I sort of feel like, why can't we just leave it to both of you to solve all this? You know, wire the country, figure out the rural area. We had Larry Irving up and saying, hey, don't forget the parts of cities that aren't connected. And so let me just start, with you, Shirley, and ask, what are the deficits in our infrastructure that we have to get right to make the promise of 5G and single millimeter wave and all of this, inclusive and to really make it work for the nation?
So, Steve, that's a loaded question. And I would say a multi-million-dollar question.
Just millions?
And let me
just millions we can handle.
Billions, trillions. So you forget how big this country is, and that becomes a big part. Part of it is a geography question, and not only that, with the diverse geography we have. So when you look at the United States, and the challenge there is to provide connectivity, it's a lot of landmass. And even as you were kind of delving in, and I don't want to jump around too much, but you were delving into millimeter wave and 5G. All of that requires a wired infrastructure. So you've got to start thinking about, what is it going to take to actually get that infrastructure out to these areas? And I think that we've got a lot of work to do. We've got some great programs that are in place, but, historically, you've got to look at it that you've got, in a lot of ways, people like to talk about the rural-urban divide. I really see it more as a rural-rural divide. You've got community-based entities that are out there and innovators that are out there providing technology and connectivity to their communities. And then you've got some very large incumbent carriers, who historically had those territories, but are now so focused on their competitive markets that we need to find solutions for the people who live in some of those market territories. So it's a big task ahead. But even as you were talking about building smart cities, we've got to think about what does it take to build smart rural communities and how do you get everybody to the table on that?
Jonathan, how do you see the picture? I mean, Shirley just put on the fan that we've got lots of wiring still to do. And, I mean, there's a lot I don't understand about the wireless world and how much it depends on being wired. But do you have a way for your members to strategically leapfrog over the infrastructure deficits we have?
I think we do. We're making unprecedented investments in infrastructure, 30 billion a year, more than any other industry in the country. This is really private sector driven. This is not something that we need a lot for, except we need to make sure that we have the ability to properly site the equipment, which we've gotten support for, not only from the federal government, but nearly 30 states have passed laws to enable broadband deployment to be streamlined. The Federal Communications Commission just last month issued a ruling that cleared the way for siting equipment on existing structures so that we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel when we're trying to upgrade to 5G on existing structures. So the FCC is getting it right. Of course, we need more spectrum. They're trying to identify as much as they can. They have put out a 5G fund, $9 billion they propose, and I think they need to move fast on that. But we're not relying on support outside of the industry. It's something that we can do ourselves if we just get governments basically to work with us in a cooperative way, which we have. I mean, municipalities are largely supportive of this. They recognize they need 5G in their communities. So we're, getting the process streamlined sufficiently. We're getting on a federal and state level support for doing that. And we'll make the investments to make it happen. Already you're seeing 5G begin to spread across the country, including a lot of rural areas of the country. And we expect after a short period of massive investment and building, we'll get it done. One thing I am worried about is making sure we have the workforce to get it done. But short of that, we're moving ahead.
I mean, do we have the workforce?
We really don't. We have not the skills in place. I mean, right now we have this pandemic, which has slowed us down a little bit, but not much. But it's also opened up the workforce. I mean, we were really tight on labor, but now we have all these people that are looking for work, but we have to have a mechanism to reskill them. So Congress, for example, is talking about investing $80 billion that was approved by the House for broadband deployment, putting it on steroids. We're already trying to build up 5G so the workforce is tight as it is. If we want to make this happen, we need to put the workforce on steroids as well. We need to make sure that we invest in training programs. I mean, a tiny portion of that 80 billion will go a long way if it was invested by Congress in training and apprenticeships and helping employers, giving employers incentives to make sure their workforce is ready for this. I mean, there's a lot of competing demands, but I think we all understand that if we get 5G built and win the race to 5G and beat the Chinese, we're going to create jobs not only in our sector, in the telecommunications sector, but in virtually every other sector of the economy.
Let me just ask you, let me get you both in a little bit of trouble here, and ask you this question that it used to be when you said the words industrial policy, like in the Obama administration or the Bush administration, you were, shuttled outside the door. You were never allowed to articulate those words. Now everyone's celebrating it. But, I sort of feel like now we talk about industrial policy, but I'm not sure we have one. And in this area, when we're talking about 5G and we're talking about what we need, we talk about training workers, we talk about, building technology and basically blocking some foreign companies from telecom infrastructure. That by nature is industrial policy, but are we getting it right? I mean, one of the questions is, what does the United States need to do, Shirley and Jonathan, to get that bet right? Because you are picking winners and losers in that case, are you not, Shirley?
Absolutely. You're picking winners and losers, and you really got to kind of think beyond kind of the current mindset. So I would step back just a little bit and say, there's a couple of different questions I think you're asking, to be honest with you. But one of the things that I think we need to do, when you're talking about, who's going to win, who's the first, who's the fastest, I think you've got to look at what makes sense. I agree with Jonathan on a number of things, certainly in terms of, how we develop our workforce and how we train people, how we make sure that we're actually using the right technology that keeps America and national security in place. But I also think we've got to even take really elementary steps. So whether you call it industrial policy or whether you just kind of call it smart public policy, for example, when I think about connectivity, we've got to do a better job of mapping, and you can't just throw it to Congress or to the FCC. Everybody's trying to take some good steps here, but it's kind of like trying to solve a problem when we don't even know quite what the problem actually is. And that is where I think we need to go back to some basics when we think about whether it is putting in infrastructure, fiber networks. And I will say, this is where I love you, Jonathan, but I disagree. You absolutely need fiber to actually make wireless work, regardless of where you are. But those are some of the steps that I would take back, again, but Jonathan may have some additional thoughts there.
Jonathan, were those fighting words?
No, actually, Shirley, I don't think we disagree. I think we do agree. You need fiber connected to every antenna. Right now, the biggest business in the wireline is connecting that fiber to the antennas. So yeah, we do agree, but ultimately the antenna will give you the reach you need in rural areas. Stepping back to the industrial policy question, the Chinese are engaging in industrial policy. Right now, they've selected 5G as the winner. And I think, communist allocation of capital is not nearly as efficient as ours. In the United States, we're doing it through private investment. But what the Chinese are getting right is, yes, 5G is, if you're going to do industrial policy, if you're going to do a state-run type economy, a great idea. In the United States, all we're asking is help us get there. Don't throw up impediments. But we're willing to work reasonably with governments. And I think we've set reasonable guidelines. We'll work within the rights of way. We'll set height limits. But let us build these networks. And secondly, education is something that has always been the province of government. And we need support for reskilling workers to come into our industry. You can bet that the Chinese aren't saying, oh, geez, we don't have enough technicians to do this work. They say X number of people are going into the schools, they're going to get in there, they're going to take these courses, and they're going to build this. And then they remove every impediment to getting it done. All we're saying is we want to do that on our own, but let's have a little bit of support. It's hard to make the American system move on a dime like that, but let's at least make sure that we're getting support to where it needs to be in community colleges, doing telecommunications courses. And yes, I think, fiber, let's teach them fiber splicing, because you'd have to do that to get to the antenna. But ultimately, the complicated issue is when that antenna is in a really complex environment at the end of the line, where there's a lot more antennas closer to end users in 5G, it requires technical skills to advance at the same time. And we better make sure that we have people ready to do that.
One of the, I think, big challenges, and right at the core of the reason we did this conference, is we've seen lots of conversations about gadgets being connected, about the Internet of Things, 5G, data, all of this coming together. And it almost sounded like there's a, techno-determinism that's beyond people and humans that it's supposed to be about. So I said, well, why don't we talk about what humans want? Put them back in the driver's seat. But there is this tension, I think, between what's happening technologically and what's possible, and whether people become enhanced and empowered by it, or whether they become victims of it. And so I know you both represent industry, but I guess my question is, not what's the answer, but how do you get it right so that humans aren't left behind, so that they are built in to this and not just run over? Shirley?
That is such an intriguing question, because you're kind of saying, how do we use technology for the good? And honestly, if there have been any lessons that we have learned from this pandemic, it should be how technology has really helped us stay connected, helped our kids continue to learn, helped our people to use telehealth instead of going into what might be a dangerous situation. So I think it's finding that balance. Where is it that, when you're talking about precision ag, the ability to increase the ROI and the efficiency for an American farmer without tipping to the point of, well, you know what, I don't need anybody to actually, man the farm. I think that there are so many interesting applications we are just on the verge of. But the things that I find the most intriguing are the ones that actually have that human element, where the technology aids our ability as humans to do something better, to do it smarter, to do it faster, but also with an edge of collaboration. So I'd like to think that we've learned a lot about that during the past 4 months, and those are lessons that we can take forward. But I think that this has accelerated some of those artificial intelligence, connected devices, has really kind of gone into overdrive, given the fact that we are all doing all kinds of connected things from wherever we may be these days.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, obviously there's good and bad that comes with the internet. I thought it was going to be all good when we first started, when I was on the FCC, in an earlier era. But I think Shirley's dead on that, we are looking at this pandemic. We couldn't do our jobs without broadband today. And I think about the healthcare applications and the life-saving service that telecommunications can provide, where people can't go to their doctors, so they're calling in on FaceTime to determine whether they need to go into the hospital because they can't breathe. There's a lot of great changes that are going to happen. And our industry delivers the capability. We deliver the bandwidth. And then ultimately, I'm not a policymaker anymore, so it's not our determination to decide what to do with it. But we see what we call economics externalities. We see that our industry invests $30 billion a year, but we don't necessarily recover the value of that. You look at the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons that are making incredible profits relative to the carriers or those that are delivering broadband technology, and the profits are accruing to every industry in the country, to jobs, to economic development, to healthcare, to education, to keeping people connected. And yes, there's some things that go with that we don't all necessarily like, but there's also some wonderful things that happen. And if we didn't do it here in the United States, if we let the Chinese, for example, win the race to 5G, the next Uber might be founded there. The next whatever it might be, the next application we haven't even thought of yet will happen in another country, and those jobs won't happen here, and people won't be able to put the food on the table for their families or generate that economic growth in rural areas, which would otherwise be there if they were connected. So I think from a policymaker perspective, the 5G investments are more than justified by the fact that every sector of the economy is going to benefit, even if there are some downsides that ultimately policymakers can't control when those broadband pipes are wide open.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and Jonathan, we didn't get to the part about you being a great harmonica player and playing with rock Hall of Famers, and I see the musical keyboards above you, but that'll be a whole nother show. But I want to thank Shirley Bloomfield, CEO of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, and Jonathan Adelstein, President and CEO of the Wireless Industry Association. Thank you so much for your insights into this, and I hope you'll come back someday because we'll keep at this. So thank you.
Perfect. Take care.
So my colleague Bob Cusack has been listening to me here for a minute. And I just want to say, Bob, maybe one of the mistakes we make in this forum or these kinds of forums is we're bringing on really competent people who seem to have their act together. They've got a plan, they've got strategy, they know what money they have going on. And, government lately doesn't seem to be operating with those kinds of plans. So, maybe we ought to have a thing of, people that just aren't as organized, or, sloppier. But, I know this is silly to say, because government and all of these things aren't so neatly achieved. And there are a lot of accidents and failures to act. And I guess my question is, when you're an expert in politics is messy. And so what do you think the blind spots of today's conversation are on the messy side?
Well, I thought your interview just now was very interesting, and Jonathan was mentioning China, and that they are not going to be sitting back and saying, well, we've got a workforce issue, what are we going to do about it? That basically they're better at dealing with their workforce issues than we are. And it was interesting in the conversation, too, that you need, obviously, you're talking about private industry, but being helped by the federal and state governments. But when you think about the workforce and going forward is, listen, I mean, we've got an aging population, so if there are workforce issues now, then there's going to be problems down the road. And the other thing that your conversation made me think of is, as bad as COVID-19 has been to the health and to our economic well-being and millions of people losing jobs, think about if COVID-19 had hit before the internet. That would even be more devastating because so many more people wouldn't be able to do their jobs from home. So that, I think, kind of with some of the thoughts that came out of your conversation with them.
There was a book once called More Human, and this book was written by a conservative. He actually has a Fox News show, and the idea that he was positing is that progress may be the wrong ideal, that maybe we need to think about what people need in their lives, slow things down, not look at, all of these steps forward. I don't necessarily buy it, but it's a very interesting take that perhaps, and it gets at that question of the nexus between progress and keeping it connected to people, and whether that is, fundamental or not. Let me ask you another question, which is about debt, because nearly every person that we've had on, I think we'll have somebody on later that raises a counterpoint to this. But a lot of people talk about the need for more investment, more infrastructure, more money for schools, safety, investment in science. But our debt levels are skyrocketing. Do they matter to anyone anymore? Because you've sort of seen a lot of the GOP in Congress all of a sudden doesn't seem to care much about debt, and maybe some of the Democrats look like fiscal conservatives in this, but we don't talk about debt. We talk about, what do we need to put in it? But is that a topic that politically has been taken off the table?
I think it's a great question, Stephen. I do think that eventually this debt is going to matter. I mean, you have entitlement programs, specifically Medicare, that are going bankrupt. And as you mentioned, neither party is really talking about it now. And at the beginning of this Congress, Nancy Pelosi adopted a pay-as-you-go rule, which did not go over well with the left of her party. I'm wondering in the next Congress, and in all likelihood Democrats are going to retain the House, if they're going to jettison that rule, because there is this thinking, and some on the left, that the deficits don't matter. But when you look at our programs that have to be funded, Social Security and Medicare, unfortunately Congress, which is broken, they don't deal with stuff like the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which I covered a lot, especially on the healthcare side. They didn't balance the budget until they had to. Medicare was going bankrupt. It was a couple years away. So I do think eventually it's going to matter, but right now it really doesn't.
Well, Bob, thank you for hanging out with us for a while and sharing your thoughts. I have a lot more questions for you, so don't go away. And now we have a sponsor perspective portion of our program. Before we get underway, a quick clarification. While this interview is being conducted by me and these questions are mine, this content should be considered not editorial. With that, I'm joined by Qualcomm's Vice President of Public Affairs, Christine Trimble. Christine, it's great to see you. Are you in San Diego right now?
I am, Steve. And
I love San Diego, and we're jealous and envious. The light there is better. That's all I can say.
I thought I would make you jealous and sit outside, but it might be a little loud.
Oh, that's great. Well, listen, we've been talking a lot about connectivity, and Qualcomm, many people may not understand, but Qualcomm is sort of the fundamental technology for lots of the internet infrastructure that we've had. We're talking about healthcare and education. But there were previous Gs. We're talking a lot about 5G today, but we'll go back to the 3G world, in which Irwin Jacobs and his team, and you, Irwin Jacobs, the founder of Qualcomm, I have the privilege of interviewing Irwin in the past. But I'm just interested in when you were at that 3G moment before we had that national infrastructure, and people used to think Qualcomm was going to be a failure. I remember those days as well. Did you see ahead? Did you see what was going to be coming in the future? How prescient were you, or did you just accidentally succeed?
Well, it's fascinating to be where we're at now and to think back what it was like then. In fact, we're celebrating our 35th anniversary year. This month, the company was founded in July of 1985 by Irwin Jacobs, as you noted, and we actually had Dr. Jacobs host an event for employees this month, and he talked a lot about the history of Qualcomm and what it was like to introduce a technology at a time when the industry was going in a different direction, that was CDMA technology. And I feel fortunate that I was able to be part of that effort and advocacy efforts to help get that technology deployed and commercialized around the world. And it was at that time in '85, Dr. Jacobs actually told employees that that we are here because someday everyone will have their own phone number. And if you think about that, it was at that time it was really hard to imagine that and that networks could be made that powerful and more reliable. But at the same time, we're seeing now an explosion of network capability. According to the GSMA, there are more wireless subscribers in sub-Saharan Africa than there are in North America, which is just so interesting, I think. There's a lot that I think people take for granted now. I have a son who's a college sophomore, and he doesn't really know a world where without being able to stream his favorite shows on his phone or use Instagram on his phone. And I'm just in awe of how far that the company has come and that the world has come in that period.
Well, this is a little bit off script, but I want to share it. Years ago, I did an article on the Qualcomm Foundation and some of the things you were funding, and they were just kind of like, weird little tracks, in a cool way. But one of the things that you funded, I found fascinating, because the cell phone and smartphone deployment in Africa was so high. You were funding health programs so that people, a female cotton farmer in Congo knew more about her vital signs and health data and statistics than any of my family members in America did. And so there was a time where you were already innovating and experimenting in the healthcare space and connectivity and smartphones years ago. And today we're talking about that kind of craze and new opportunities today in America. But do you have any insights into that? Because I found that to be one of the smartest. I used to talk about it all the time, saying, how can people in Congo be so far ahead of what's going on than the United States in healthcare and connectivity?
Yeah, there's so many examples of that. I think one of the things that has been inherent in Qualcomm and in our culture of R&D is to develop the technology before people really know what the exact need is. And the example that you're giving of the usage of it for medical information is a perfect one. I remember our former CTO and one of the original 7 executives who started Qualcomm used to tell a story about when he went to global standards organizations and said, we need to design a system that can accommodate more data. And these senior reps from companies worldwide said, no, why would we want to do that? We get text and email on our phones. Why would we need that? And so I think that set Qualcomm off also on developing the capability to get large amounts of data on your phone and to send and receive, and to really put the capability out there, give people the tools, and then see what how the technology would be used. One of the other things I think people don't realize is that Qualcomm had come up with the first C-made smartphone and had to do that, demonstrate it by basically taping together a PDA with another voice phone to be able to make the point that you will want to get all of your data, you will want to use your phone as a computer in the future. And in fact, Qualcomm also came up with the first app store, which the diagram for that is in the Patent and Trademark Office on a picture of a whiteboard. Susie Armstrong, who's speaking I know a little later, a senior VP of engineering at Qualcomm, actually walked through that exhibit, saw the picture of that whiteboard with the design of the App Store and said, hey, I actually wrote the code for that App Store. So It just goes back to show you a lot of the work that's done in the case of 5G 10 years prior to the technology being rolled out. The work is being done to give people the capabilities on which to come up with the different use cases. And I think now that we're in the environment we're in and in this global crisis, we're going to see more and more use in remote education and healthcare, just as you're saying. I think that even as we return to what is a new normal, that distance learning, remote healthcare, remote working, I think that those all of those things are here to stay.
Right. Well, you've just covered, a lot, which I was going to ask you about. But we've added another. You went from 3G, then we added another G. It reminds me of Tigger. How do you spell Tigger? T-I-double-G-er. And so you added another G. And so you get to 4G, and we've been talking about it today a little bit about how this created new opportunities on data transfer, and all of a sudden we see firms like Uber and Lyft emerge. So what is the what is the appetite? What is the thing that drives your engineers and thinkers forward? Because you haven't stopped. So you did 3G to 4G, and now 4G, we're now moving into a 5G world. And what is that appetite so that we can make this not just sort of a discussion about this static moment, but what drives that process as we look at how you're revolutionizing opportunities for business, how kids are learning, what we're doing with telemedicine and telehealth, all of that. Christine?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, you're not hearing the kinds of skepticism or, naysayers now around 5G. I think people have come to expect that they're going to have high-speed data on their phones. They have for a decade and a half or so. And I think that with 5G, where it's not just about people connecting to people, but it's about connecting everything to everything. So everything from a small appliance in your kitchen to the largest supercomputer you can imagine, and just connecting everything. I think we're going to see a much more safer and more connected world with those opportunities. And you think about everything from medical devices, hospitals, traffic signals, industrial machinery, farms, cities. It's kind of an endless list where everything is connected. And I think this is really this is one of those breakthrough technologies, as you said, in the 2G, 3G, 4G, and now 5G that Qualcomm has been at the working at the core of for many years.
Well, Christine, I hope we can do a deal. And my boss is sitting here, so he's watching. But I want to do a deal, and we'll leave it off the record if that's okay, Bob. But I want to go, and we're discussing all this stuff we've done in the past, but I want to see what's coming next. I kind of like the crystal ball stuff. I'll keep it off. I just want to go to Qualcomm and just see what the next 6G, 7G world is going to look like. Okay, after we is that a deal? You accept?
Yeah. Well, why don't we get a crystal ball out and start to look 10 years ahead?
Okay, that would be great. Well, Christine, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really excited about everything that our engineers are working on.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for supporting today's program.
Thank you, Steve, for having us, and thank you, The Hill, for hosting this.
Thank you.
Event.
Terrific. Well, 5G technology promised to make us more connected than ever before. My next guest knows exactly where this technology can take us and hopefully how it can tackle some of the inequities that exist in the digital ecosystem out there. Mike Rogers is a former member of Congress, a very cool former member of Congress in my personal opinion, representing Michigan's 8th Congressional District. While in Congress, he was chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. But that's going to be a different TV show, a different show another day. Today, he's chairman of the 5G Action Now group. And Congressman Rogers, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just start out and ask you, because we're talking about 5G as it's almost already here. But I talked to developers, to people out there, and I said, it's still wobbly, it's still spotty. There are permitting problems in cities. We're not all there. So let's not turn this into a rah-rah moment. What is not working out in the 5G space that you need to work out?
So, and thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to see you. Thanks for the kind words of getting out of Congress is kind of like being on parole. So any kind words at all are well received. So there's several things that we just haven't gotten right yet. And I do think that the marketing and advertising on 5G by companies is a little bit ahead of where we actually are on deploying 5G. Certainly some of that technology is entering into the ecosystem of what we will need for 5G, but there's some big hurdles. Let me give you an example. Spectrum. We need spectrum opened up. And so one of the things that 5G now that we've been trying to do is advocate for a good spectrum transfer There's this something called Goldilocks spectrum, and that's the sweet spot for us to have a more rapid deployment of 5G gear across the United States. So Chairman Pai's done a wonderful job. He's done some of that. We're going to have that spectrum. It's going to open up the companies that are in the spectrum. Some of the satellite companies that have been operating in that band, if you will, for a long, long time, invested money in it, have said, we think we can do this. We're going to participate in handing off this spectrum. So that really has to happen before we really get to 5G, number one. And number two, little things. We have to get rid of the old Huawei gear. We have to rip and replace and do things like that to make sure that our trusted vendor infrastructure has the capability to actually win this fight and become real vendors in the next 5G build out that's going to happen. So all of those little things, I call it the underbrush of 5G, needs to get there. And you're right, we have lots of towers to put up. Millimeter wave probably works okay in cities because there's lots of density, but you still have to have lots of antennas. You get this other spectrum, it's the sub-6 they call it, is really, really good stuff. So that would give us more options and more opportunities to build out. And then again, siting these towers all across the United States. Some cities have banned 5G towers because they think there's something bad with them. So we have an education campaign to go on to make sure people are making decisions based on what is really happening with these towers and what it means to the economy. And man, we do not want to come in second place on 5G to China. That would be a disaster for future prosperity of generations of Americans.
You know, the Hill is a place, and you know the Hill well. The Hill likes lists. You know, what are the best lobbying firms? What are the worst? You know, what are the best cities in the country that are getting 5G right? What are the worst?
You know, it would be hard to say. The cities who have come out and banned, and there's several, and I don't want to embarrass them.
Go ahead and embarrass it. It's a great opportunity. Put a spotlight on them.
Oh my God. I would say those cities, they tend to be out west, concentrated out west, are making a serious mistake by banning 5G towers and the ability to move 5G. You know, cities that are getting it right. And remember, 5G will be most impactful for cities up front because it's going to be easier to deploy. You'll have the market valuation of, you know, I'm going to get a return on my investment if I invest in 5G in New York and Chicago and Miami and San Francisco and Los Angeles much quicker than I will if I'm trying to build it out in rural broadband, which is a whole nother issue we hopefully will deal with someday. But that's going to happen first. So those cities are going to get it right first. A lot of cities are competing for it. They want to be the first. They want to be that first city that has 5G. And really why this is important, you think about wireless cars, telemedicine, you know, remote manufacturing, remote surgery, all of that has to have a 5G very low latency. And that latency is likely to happen in cities first, and then we're going to build our way out. And that's not, you know, obviously we need to build it out if we're going to have a more robust participation. So cities, for the most part, are going to be okay. It's just these few knockoffs who have decided that 5G does something bad for you, which there's no scientific evidence to show that. That's where we're going to bump into some problems. But the problem is with those cities, we'll go right around it. And everyone else will be prospering with this new 5G technology. And remember, it's like it is almost $4 trillion in the next 15 years, 22 million jobs just surrounding the 5G build out. And then all of the things that happen because of 5G, we can't do on 4G.
So, Mike, one of the great geopolitical contests today between China and the United States is over 5G. And so you just mentioned a moment ago Huawei and those issues. And I'm just going to try to be polite, but to those of us who watch it and have been watching, these relationships for years, it's confusing because some days it looks like the president is using the Huawei issue as a negotiating ploy and that he might give it. And we saw that with ZTE. What is the line between using something and holding a firm hostage over something and really saying it's a clear national security issue? Because those of us, and Bob Cusack and I were talking about earlier, those of us who see who might see that, okay, it's a national security issue, then what are you doing to actually build an option? Where's your strategy with Europe, with Ericsson, with Nokia, with other vendors and possibilities with Qualcomm to deal with that? Because otherwise you've divided the world. So I'm just interested, are you engaged at all in that debate on saying, okay, if you're going to go that direction, then these other steps are required? Because a lot of us don't see those other steps being put in place.
Yeah, I am involved, and I will say that we're a little bit slow in this. That's what's been frustrating to a lot of us. And I think the president was right to say, hey, we've had enough of these unfree market principles being engaged to beat back competition from what we would call trusted vendors, companies like Nokia or Ericsson or others. And so what can we do? And let me back up. The Chinese government has decided they want Huawei and ZTE to be their dominant players worldwide. So what are they doing to ensure that? They're spending billions of dollars on research and development, the government, not the companies, the government, and then the companies are subsidized by the government to give these outrageous deals. The one I heard just the other day, a 20-year payment plan where you pay zero for the first 3 years, all the engineering, all of the costs for putting it up at the network and operating the network is not charged to you. There is no market-based business in the world that can do that and can compete with that. So people have been saying, well, gosh, it's almost free. I might as well take it.
Well, Mike, that used to be called dumping, but we were part of the WTO and we could go challenge nations that were dumping, but the United States is not really helping the WTO very well. So, I don't mean to interrupt, but we used to call that dumping, right?
Fine. Well, completely. Or, they're illegally subsidizing these business deals. Now, there are things that we can do, what we would do with a free market approach to this. And we want to strengthen, by the way, those trusted vendor networks. So, one of the ways we can do that, this plan called Rip and Replace that Congress has passed, I think it's about $2 billion to say where Huawei gear did get infiltrated into these networks when there wasn't as much heightened security for it. We need to get rid of that gear and replace it as fast as we can. We should help the companies do that, number one. Number two, what we can do to beat back these Chinese subsidized deals is offer our own loan programs. And we used to do this a lot more, where, if you had a company that needed a loan to do business and fill in the blank, you still had to pay the loan back, which is unlike the Chinese model. But it does help make these vendors more competitive. And we can do that under the national security guise. And I argue, yeah, we ought to do that. We need to compete in this. And this is the thing that I think is lost on this whole topic, Steve, that I think is really important. So in the last couple of years, China has used this something called social scoring system. And every citizen in China gets assigned this kind of a grade, if you will, based on really hundreds of points of data that the government collects on these citizens. And because the Chinese Communist Party didn't like the performance of that particular citizen, last year alone, they did something like 3 million denials of domestic travel, meaning can't buy an airline ticket, can't buy a bus ticket, can't buy a train ticket, because the Communist Party decided they didn't like who you were doing. This is the same government that's investing in this 5G build out all over the world, saying, hey, nothing to worry about. No, nothing to see here. Move along. And for some reason, we've had a difficult time getting people to understand that once the Chinese touch your data, they're going to own your data. And we just can't have that. That's why we've been on this kind of aggressive push to say we have to do better. And yes, pulling out of the WTO was not a great, I think that was the wrong solution. I think we should have gotten in there and knocked elbows a little bit versus just saying I quit. There's lots to improve there for sure. But I think we could have done better by staying in and, as I said, throwing a few elbows. And then go after these other programs, but we have to do it soon. So Spectrum, cleaning out the underbrush, doing these programs to say we're going to help our trusted vendors replace gear in the United States, makes them more competitive. And then once we get that spectrum, let these companies invest in it. It's going to go crazy, and we will reap the benefit of that.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned the China case, the social capital, facial recognition, because I think we still have to have more discussions about the governance of this technology in America as well. We've got a question for you from our public. So, Michael, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Michael Novak. I'm with the Open Voice Network. We're a nonprofit directed fund of the Linux Foundation, focused on making conversational voice worthy of user trust in the private and public sector. Currently, we are leading a collaborative cross-industry initiative to develop policies and standards that will enable secure, easy access to public agencies and services that citizens are accustomed to over any conversational voice assistant platform. My question today concerns conversational voice capabilities. During the COVID era, social distancing is becoming the norm. What policy and practical implementation obstacles still need to be overcome? And what role do our guests think that voice-controlled capabilities can play to serve communities and the public good in formal education, healthcare, and social service accessibility? Thank you for your time.
Well, Mike, this is a really important question. So, I'm going to just piggyback on what Michael Novak just shared, which is, certainly he's saying, where's voice going to go? How do we get this right? But part of the question, and I hope you can share it with the audience, is what does the 5G world open up as by way of opportunity? 4G, we had Lyft, Uber, lots of other businesses. He's asking about voice in a kind of very different sense of density of data and transfer. So as you explain 5G, and you're going to respond to Michael, but can you just, as we wrap up here, kind of give the best pitch you can of what comes next by way of opportunity from 5G?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about all the things that probably won't happen as we come out of 5G. Probably not as much travel as we used to do. Do you really need to do four board meetings remotely? Or now can you use a platform, a voice platform and a video platform to engage in certain numbers? Now, I'm an in-person kind of guy. I think we need to have those interpersonal relationships, and all of that is very, very important. But I do think businesses are going to take a new look at what kind of interaction that means. So can you do a lot more from home, or at least a percentage from home that we couldn't do before? And I think people have seen the productivity levels of working at home, which has been, really a positive thing. Same with education. So I do believe kids, that K through 12 experience to me is really important. I don't think we ought to wipe it out and say everybody stay at home and stare at a TV screen for 6 hours. That's just not going to work. But what we could do is have a layered approach to that, where you have some sense of time at home versus time in a classroom. I do think that can happen. And you can also, some of your best teachers can teach more kids based on the ability to connect online. Huge benefit, I think, for kids who don't have access or have a long travel time to get to school, those kinds of things. So on education, I think this is going to just rock that world in a good and positive way if we get it right. But making sure that everybody has that connectivity. What we found in this, when people had stay-at-home orders and they were still trying to have classroom time, some kids just did not have access. They didn't have access to a computer, if they had a computer, didn't have access to the right bandwidth to be able to conduct a real time and connect to an education environment. And then again, you have to have great support around some of these children. Everybody learns differently, and some kids just don't learn well by staring at a TV screen for any length of time. All of that is going to have to be worked through. However, that being said, we need to make sure that through 5G, rural broadband build out, all of that all the kids in America have the opportunity to gain that educational value from being connected. And same with telemedicine. In areas that don't have, we have huge swaths of the country don't have gynecology or fill in the blank. They don't have heart surgeons or whatever. And there are a lot of cases around the world that have that. What better way to fill in that hole? It doesn't replace it, but what better way to supplement that than having remote telemedicine? We're not going to get this right if you don't have good both voice and video quality interaction. And again, you don't want to have a meeting where you're getting ready to tell your doctor and the pain here is doing this, and it gets all blurry, and the doctor comes back and says, "Ooh, I think you're fine," because I didn't hear what that was. And so those are the kinds of things we have to get right in order for this to work for the next generation. But think of the productivity on just the data side. Remember, 50% of the data now is going to be out at the edge of these networks, which means we're used to controlling data at the core and in the center. That's going to be gone. Half of that data
Right.
has to be out at the edge. That's going to fundamentally change the way we look at privacy, which I think a little bit that Michael was talking about,
Right.
and how we communicate. All of that is going to have a policy implication and a technology and a security implication as well.
Well, Mike Rogers, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, chairman of 5G Action Now, thank you so much for your time today and your insights on this, and I hope you'll come back.
I hope so. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Great to be with you. My next guest is Gary Brantley. He's the Chief Information Officer of the City of Atlanta. He's the former CIO of DeKalb Public Schools. He's someone who's been at the forefront of making real change in the area of digital inclusion. Gary Brantley, thank you so much for joining us today. And I should just say, you know, all of us have been watching Atlanta, you know, just so much going on there. I mean, the epicenter of so many waves. So I hope you're well. And I just want to get you a quick snapshot because you're responsible for actually, you know, schools, inclusion, the digital world, and we've all been shoved into it. You know, what's going well and what's not going well?
Yeah, I think around the country, you can really look at what's not going well. I think when Atlanta's no different, when we had to jump into this telework posture, one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was our underserved community. And so when we look at our underserved community, what we were finding was a huge gap. I think your guest before me really hit on that. He really talked about, you know, the 5G episode, you know, which I have my own opinion on. But at the same time, we really started to see the disparities real time. And I think it caught the nation's attention around those issues, really trying to see how we can help our communities, you know, at this critical time with the digital divide. But not only doing that, partnering with our universities locally. We have some of the top universities here in the city of Atlanta, and also making sure that our residents and our city services continue to flourish from the technology side of things.
Okay, let me ask you a question. You know, Mike Rogers a minute ago just asked or mentioned some new lingo in this space we're all going to have to learn eventually. Sub-6, single millimeter wave, you know, and I don't even know what they mean yet, but I, you know, toss them out. But, you know, is there an opportunity to leapfrog, to take this and create a better social contract than what we have today? I think always, you know, from a policy guy, you know, the question is, do you move incrementally, or is there a way to solve problems with a strategic leap? Do any of the technologies you see coming forward within your city give you an opportunity to redo things in a way you couldn't do from an incremental perspective?
Absolutely. I think, you know, when you start to talk about this whole shift, even with COVID, I think that's proved to be extremely valuable for the city. It's allowed us to really be able to leapfrog in some areas that in government you traditionally, you know, take a long time, what I would call the whole turtle effect. I think that when you look at our ability to be able to pivot and move quickly around just the circumstances that exist, it really showed us that in a lot of spaces, we don't have to move incrementally. We can actually jump and leapfrog to where we need to be. And I think that, you know, our actions have really proved that. When you look at our focus on having a digital city hall, that's really been a big focus. When you look at our focus on making sure our city departments can actually perform and actually operate remotely, not just short term, but long term. Those are different types of scenarios where we would have incrementally done this. But at the same time, with the things that are going on right now today, we were actually able to leapfrog, I would say, a couple of years ahead as it relates to city government services.
You know, we're sort of in the story business, storytelling business here in the Hills. So I'm always looking for good stories, and this is probably an unfair question. But when you talk about reaching communities that have been disadvantaged, left behind, left out, excluded, neglected, and you've been able to figure out how to wire them in, how to bring them in, have you experienced firsthand how this has changed their aspirations or the possibilities they have?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't become what you can't see. And a lot of times technology is that bridge for it. A lot of times, and I saw that specifically in school districts. I was in one of the largest school districts in the country outside of Metro Atlanta. And some of the things that we were able to accomplish in that short period of time was short of amazing. I mean, really putting thousands upon thousands, close to 70,000 devices in kids' hands, and also providing them with the training needed, but also providing internet access to those kids. It opened up a wide range of possibilities and opportunities to be able to learn Mandarin, and have those conversations virtually, to be able to see things across the country and across the world that you normally wouldn't have access to. It really helps with language barriers. It really helps when you really start to look at some of those kids in those underserved communities who will never take a plane flight out of the city of Atlanta. That's huge. And what ends up happening is you start to see a transformation, not only of your underserved communities, but also the interests in businesses that want to be a part of it as well. And so that's what we started to see. It really starts to push and thrive the economy locally where you're at, when they start to see the investment at the basic level around how you want to serve your underserved communities.
One of the things that Mike Rogers, former Chairman Rogers, did is he took a kind of swipe at unnamed Western cities that weren't as 5G friendly as he wanted. So he didn't mention the Eastern city, Atlanta. But I'm interested in, as you get together, which I know you do, with other cities and city leaders around the nation, both in education, but also information officers, what do you see as the legitimate resistance or concern points of some cities that aren't stepping the direction that Atlanta is going?
Yeah, I really, when you look at the benefit of 5G, a lot of cities have really, and I've been in conversations about this, they really haven't seen, the benefit of it. I think just now we're really starting to see the full benefits of 4G. And now we're jumping into 5G. And I'm sure this has been a conversation even before I got on here today around just the advertisement component of 5G. It's been, from an advertising side of things, it's been really special. I think it's been tremendous. But when you look at the real benefits for the community, we're not really seeing them. I think Atlanta Hartsfield Jackson Airport is one of the or was one of the first airports to be 5G. And so when you really look at its possibilities, I think they're great. When you really look at what it's giving us right now, I think it has a long way to go. We talk about, especially in city and providing city services and making sure that we have that real-time data to make sure we're making the correct decisions and providing the right service vehicles for our residents. That data has to be at the edge. And so what that means is, we have devices that are sitting all over the city of Atlanta that can provide us real-time and quick data, but the 5G component has to be there. The infrastructure has to be there and in place for us to really be able to take advantage of the tons of data that will be sitting on the edge.
Let me just ask you finally, Gary, I wish we had a lot more time because, this is cool. I would love to go on a deep dive in a lot of these corners, talk about, kids in schools and all of this, but we're going to have to wait to another day. But you do have something called Accelerate Atlanta. And, I know that the progress that you have to make, retrofitting a city, getting all the pieces in place, finding the funding for it, teaching people and educating and bringing them on is a complex system. How do you get the partnerships right? How do you set the tone right? How do you get real partnerships as opposed to just, sign on by name partnerships? I'm interested in that because I think a lot of people are watching, from around the nation. And I think these insights in the fact that it's not, a set of single players coming forward, but you do have a very successful partnership in Atlanta. We'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this partnership. First and foremost, I want to say it starts with leadership. I think, our mayor is a great leader for this city and has been since she stepped in place. And one of the things that we talked about is Atlanta is really known for this, shiny, smart city type of city and projects. And so what we wanted to do was really take that same energy and focus it on our underserved communities. And so partners like Microsoft came forward and we started to really have conversations around a real impact. And one of the conversations that we started to have was, hey, I don't want to talk about all of the great technology you have and how you can help the city. I want to talk about how you can help our residents become better, become qualified, to make sure that the skill gaps that are there are skill gaps that are attractive to different organizations. And so this was a long conversation that we had with them. They came back, to their credit, and worked with us to round up several partners who had the same interest. And that's one of the things that was a difficult part. We talk about this stuff, but we never really have the partners on the same page. And so that's what Accelerate Atlanta is. It's going to give our residents the skill sets that they need. And I'm not talking about how to work a PowerPoint presentation. I'm talking about engineering type skill sets, cloud-based type skill sets that can really help our city become one of the best thriving cities, and really work on digital inclusion, which is a big, huge effort for our mayor and our city. And so we were able to do something, in my opinion, that most weren't. And that's to get everybody on the same page for a common goal and task, and bring the right partners to the table. And I do want to credit Microsoft for that. They've been absolutely outstanding in sharing that vision.
Well, thank you very much, Gary Brantley, Chief Information Officer of the City of Atlanta. Really great discussion. I hope we can do this again because I think you've got a lot of insights into how to make this work. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
And now for the final conversation of this hour. This is hour 2. We got another left. I'm pleased to be joined by Susie Armstrong, Senior Vice President, Engineering of Qualcomm. Qualcomm is one of the sponsors of today's program, but I had her here anyway because she's just done extraordinary engineering feats, which we're going to get into in a moment. She's also joined by Representative Scott Peters from San Diego, California. He's a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He's been a longtime advocate of investing in innovation. Scott, it's great to see you again in D.C. I don't know if you're in San Diego, and actually I think you're in Washington now, but it's great to have this discussion. What I wanted to do today is to sort of talk about something that's come up a number of times today, is trust, because we're talking a lot about a new world that everyone's been shoved into as a result of this pandemic. Online everything, teaching, healthcare, and yet we haven't talked as much about how do you get the equities of trust right. Susie, you've been at this, and I want to kind of tell my audience, I've spent some extraordinary time with you in the past where you developed the algorithm in 1997 for cell phones to surf the web. You created, packet technology that allowed all of this to transfer. It's come up several times today, but I, just want to say thank you. As we're all obsessed with it, you're the person responsible. And Scott, it's great to be with you. But let me just ask you, how do you think we ought to begin framing what trust guardrails we need? Because this is about people and what they want. And I think that gets forgotten in a lot of these conversations. So Susie, you first.
So, if you look at the cellular technology and you look at what's happened in COVID, I think it's brought the trust issue to the very forefront. Technology and cellular technology has provided us tremendous benefits, working at home and schooling at home. There's downsides as well. But I think the trust and the security issues are paramount. And I think if I can relate it right now, for example, we have been working, we have a lot of expertise in Bluetooth, and we've been working with MIT and Google and Apple on COVID contact tracing algorithms. And there's a lot of, rightfully so, there's a lot of concern about the privacy of that healthcare data in contact tracing. But what I see is in order to be able to take the most advantage of any technology, whether it's Bluetooth for COVID tracing or it's 5G, you've got to have the technologists and you've got to have the policy people and you've got to have the public work very closely together, because otherwise you lose out on the security you lose out on the benefits of this technology if you just say, it may violate privacy. We have to stop. You have to take some forward-leaning positions and actually work it out. And I think that applies very, very much to the deployment of 5G as well. 5G as a pipe or a road has very strong security features. But if you're going to use it in healthcare, and we hope we do, and fighting fires, et cetera, virtual augmented reality, you have to be able to, secure in each one of those use case industries. You've got to be able to ensure the security and the privacy to actually bring it to fruition.
Thank you. Let me ask Representative Peters, this question about contact tracing and technology and data and privacy. I interviewed recently the foreign minister of Singapore, and Singapore is deploying contact tracing technology in wearables. And he tells me they're anonymizing it, but it creates this ability by looking at GPS to notify people if they have been exposed to the coronavirus and if they need testing. And so it sounds like a good story. Do you buy that? Are there caution points for you in that story?
Well, first of all, Steve, thanks for having me. It's nice to see you again. And I 100% buy it. I'm working with Susie on this same idea from the policy side. And imagine we would even think about using the technology we had in the 1980s to do contact tracing without imagining what we could do with Bluetooth technology that can identify for you who you're next to, who you're 6 feet away from. If you happen to go to a bar, say you went to a bar on the way home without telling your wife to see your buddies. You sat around with Jim and Bob, but you didn't know who the two people who Jim and Bob bought were, or the other people in the bar. But your Bluetooth would be able to know, and if you could identify that you had a positive test, that information could automatically be disseminated to them if they've downloaded the app, if they've opted in, without fail, immediately and accurately. And you wouldn't have to also tell a contact tracer who maybe is a year out of college about your personal habits. I mean, this is something that is even more trustworthy in many ways than the old way. And the idea that we wouldn't take advantage of it and look, confront these legitimate privacy and trust issues head on as a policy matter. But let's not let the tail wag the dog. We have amazing opportunities here. We've already seen in terms of work from home. We've already seen it in terms of telemedicine, which people said would never be taken up. We're never going back in a lot of these ways. And clearly we have some privacy issues, some trust issues to deal with, but let's embrace what we've learned and let's figure out how to make it work, not back away from it because of some imagined things that we haven't even tried to deal with.
Well, look, I'm going to try to be the devil's advocate here on this for a moment and raise another point. And I'm going to say for the audience, I don't say buy this. I actually think that technology and contact tracing makes a lot of sense in this era. But there are a lot of people who say, hey, look, the Office of Management and Budget got hacked a while back. Twitter just got hacked. And so this is the U.S. government, and this is one of the best companies in America that you ought to think would have all sorts of protections in place. And so people become oriented around that one exception on safety, the one penetration, the one mistake. And it does come to mind. I've interviewed the CEO of Citizen, which is an advocate of an app-based contact tracing moment, very much along some of the lines you just said. But you can imagine that if someone's private life was disclosed or other elements came out, that it basically tilts the trust equation very much against that progress. So I don't want to make you responsible for fixing all of those problems, but I'm just wondering how our frame ought to be organized in such a way that we anticipate that and we deal with it head on so that we both establish, because I think that's part of the trust process, right?
Yeah, and to bring it over to 5G, I think part of the policy is a core part of the trust process. If you look at 5G, and again, 5G provides a lot of very interesting security features, and you can think basically of the pipe itself as being pretty darn secure. But the pipe, when the data gets out of the pipe and is stored on a computer or stored, in the sink or wherever you store data that comes out of a pipe, there's a lot of work that needs to be done between the technology people and the policy people, and it's different for every use case. The kind of security that you want to deploy in telemedicine, for example, or robotic surgery is probably different than the kind of security that you're going to deploy in a less life-threatening type of environment, monitoring, using sensors to monitor, 5G connected sensors to monitor, water uptake in trees, which is one of my favorite applications of 5G. So I guess, the technology people can put all the features in that they want for security, but unless it's a conversation amongst the healthcare people and amongst the policy people and amongst the technologists together, you don't come up with an integrated solution. And that's what I think. That's why I'm very excited about the kinds of discussions that are being had in, for example, in the standards organizations around this. You've got people attending not only from the core technology companies like Qualcomm, but you've got people attending from automotive. You've got people attending from healthcare as well.
Right.
I mean, it would be a mistake if you didn't take these head on. And I understand, for instance, in that contact tracing example, that the technologists have talked to the ACLU about privacy, and that's good. But I also say we're fortunate to live in a country where we have laws that value privacy and protect privacy. And I think we should also be aware that some of the competitor nations don't have those same values. And I think one of the things we ought to be thinking about is how to make sure that our American companies can compete on a level playing field, so that technologists that are responsive to these privacy concerns are the ones providing us our hardware and our software.
Congressman, can I ask you something? I'm going to divulge that when we were all allowed to still do cocktail parties and meet, in San Diego, you run in a cool crowd. I mean, some of the smartest biotech, biopharmaceutical, health technology, communications technology people in the nation, in the world, are in your area. And I've always been intrigued by these, incredibly innovative people that are building, bridges to a very different future. And then how DC, where we're sitting right now, is such, a ball and chain around that process and such lagging. But I guess, my question to you is when you kind of look at the regulatory world that we're in Washington, and you look at what your constituents, many of them, are creating, what do we need to solve in that? Because that's also part of the question of human connectivity and getting innovation married with governance in a bright, enlightened way. I know that's a big meta question, but I think it really matters.
Well, it's true that I live in an amazing hub of innovation. Unfortunately, the weather's not very good here. But I would say I think there's a real cultural issue with respect to both places. So, in my community, people sit around the table and they think about solving tomorrow's problems, and they welcome the opportunity to look into tomorrow, and they accept the uncertainty and they run with it. I would say DC, unfortunately, sometimes is a backwards-looking culture. It's fear of taking a step forward, fear of getting yelled at, and holding grudges about what happened, years ago. And I think that to the extent we can take some of the excitement that we have about the ability to solve problems, we can educate ourselves as policymakers about how to accommodate that where it's possible and where it's productive, and how to put guardrails on it, as you said, to make sure that we're protecting our constituents. I mean, I think we have a great opportunity here, and I hope that we will think a little bit more culturally about these changes as opportunities rather than as things that are too expensive or we don't understand. There's great potential out there, and DC needs to get out of the way a little bit, but really cooperate in a way that makes this work for everybody.
Susie, let me just give you the final word. And I just talked to Gary Brantley, who's the Chief Information Officer of Atlanta, and I'll ask you the same question. Does this 5G world that we're moving towards give us any real, genuine opportunity to solve some of the inclusion mistakes and deficits we've had in the past? Can we, when you think about trust in part, it's not just trust for the people in the camp. It's a question of how do you get trust among those people who haven't done well or haven't been connected. And I'm just interested in whether you see our social contract can be broader, bigger, better, moving into something that's going to be comprehensive, or whether that's a pipe dream on my part.
I don't think it's a pipe dream at all. And to Mr. Brantley's point, one of the things we're really excited about that COVID actually brought to the forefront of everybody's conversation is the kind of connectivity that we've been able to pull off in areas that have connectivity for education. And for example, San Diego Unified School District, which I think Congressman Peters knows is one of the largest in the country. They actually went, partially with local companies, including Qualcomm's help, they went from in-person to online teaching for all of those students, 127,000, I think, in 3 weeks. And I think that was a combination of using technology and using their contacts in the San Diego area. And I guess my point here about the social contract and where we go with this technology, just to be practical, there's a lot of discussion about. Rightfully so, about the 30 million Americans who do not have access to high-speed internet. And a lot of the focus, rightfully so, goes to rural areas. But there's also a huge number of economically underrepresented people who don't have access to that. And I like to call that not the digital divide, but it's a connectivity divide. And cellular, starting with 4G, and moving to 5G and millimeter wave, I think is a really key piece of the economy and education and workforce going forward. For example, you don't necessarily need 5G to do your homework online, but you do need cellular. And so when people talk about expanding broadband and such, I think what the pandemic actually showed to us is it's not just Wi-Fi. You can't go down to the coffee house anymore to do your homework. You can't go to the library to do your homework. These are all places where people gather. So I think it's cellular. And then if you look at 5G, and there's a lot of discussion on sub-6 spectrum versus millimeter wave spectrum, and it's all of the above to get a truly connected nation. But if you look at rural factories, for example, if you look at augmented reality for firefighters to be able to safely, enter a building and know what's going on inside, those applications require 5G, and they require millimeter wave. They require the high bandwidth. They require the fast response time. And it is those kinds of technologies that we really need to be pushing towards if we're going to be able to, take advantage for both education, for healthcare, and for all these use cases that we see.
Well, Representative Scott Peters, I want to say thank you. And isn't it cool to be on with Susie Armstrong? I mean, we owe her for so much more than sending pics on Instagram and surfing the web. There's a lot more there, but those are two highlights that many of our viewers will understand. But I want to thank you, Susie. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Peters. Really, I thank you for your time and your insights into this. And I do think that we've got to keep these trust questions and how to get it right there. Thank you for your insights on contact tracing and what we can do with Bluetooth and wearables too. So thank you both.
Yeah. It's an honor to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our second session. We're going to be back again at 3:30 p.m. Go for a run or something. We'll be back for our third and final session of the day, where I'll be speaking to some cool innovators. Madison Moxley of Lumia and Jay Walder. It's one on my bucket list to interview Jay Walder, CEO of the Virgin Hyperloop. Take an afternoon coffee break or get in your meditation session. I didn't write that. I don't meditate for the day. And we'll meet you right back here for more fascinating conversations. Thank you so much.